So this is a fun one to do. This really is a fun one to do because this is part two of So You Want to Build an Aircraft Carrier. It's infrastructure and industry, the realities of construction, what you need. And it's in many ways the easiest and, well, it could be the longest, it could also be the shortest. And the way I'm gonna do it is gonna be the shortest because if I wanted to make it longer, so it's quite simple. I just have to list through all the different individual components and how that affects and retails back into different infrastructure. But I'm going to deal this in the larger points because I don't think you want me to hear me saying, and for the 60th time, this gets back to this portion of the steel industry, but this time we are looking for low carbon, high tensile. Which is an interesting combination to try and get. Usually involves a lot of other materials and things being put into there to give you a different alloy, really. And, yeah. But basically for the 50th time. So we're not doing that, but we are going to be talking through all the stuff you need to have worked out as you're building an aircraft carrier, because there's no point trying to build an aircraft carrier, there's no point trying to operate an aircraft carrier if you can't work out these. You can't sort out these things because you need it. And for that, let's start considering and breaking down some of the components of an aircraft carrier. Well, you have an RAF station, as Casper John here wrote in 1987, and he was writing for an audience who would be more familiar with RAF stations than they would be with aircraft carriers, so basically, look, operating 60 to 80 single or small twin-engine aircraft, add the fuel, stores, firefighting equipment, and so on, which go with it. Notice, even he's saying, and so on, which go with it. But basically, this is true. You will have the full facilities of a very advanced, a fully capable airbase included in your carrier. You know, if we consider it in terms of F-35 operations, the aircraft carriers which can operate the stealth aircraft, the F-35, are some of the most valuable assets in the world because it takes so much money and so much time to set up a full-service airfield for an F-35 or for any of these aircraft because they require so much, well, how to put this, not just time for maintenance, but they require so many specialist systems to help maintain them at their best capability. Yes, you can operate them from other air bases. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you can't. What I'm saying is to operate them to their best ability, you need the facilities you have at those air bases to get the best out of them. To be able to check their skin, to be able to check their frame, to be able to check all their electronics. And yes, you can build these things. I'm not saying you can't. But it takes time and it takes money. And if conflicts happen in regions where you haven't got those facilities already prepared, you may well not have the time. And even if you do, and you have got those facilities, such a facility is going to be the number one target for any opponent. It's going to be a number one target. And yeah, you can stick in layered defenses. And again, please don't get me wrong, you can. If you have the layered defenses, which is always the fun thing when you sort of start talking about it, because some countries have the layered defenses, have the theatre level air defense system, they have the point defenses, they have the full range of systems. Some nations don't. It's one of the scarier things when you talk about it, when people start talking about the Royal Navy or even US air groups, carrier battle groups and carriers operating. Well, the Americans are a full-service force, so you could make the point, well, we can defend an airbase just as well as we can defend a carrier. I wouldn't agree you can, but I also wouldn't agree it's an I wouldn't think it's an impossibility, because we've all seen people like Habitual Line Crosser, and I've met a fair number of others. Actually, I haven't ever met them, but I've met others like them who come from that field, and I know how skilled the American air defense professionals are. So I'm not going to say no. But in Britain, we don't have that range of air defense missiles. We don't have that. So anytime someone goes, oh, we haven't got enough Type 40s, we haven't got enough this for our to protect our carriers, they at least have the ability to move. We don't even have those things for the aircraft, for the air bases. And the thing is, we should. Okay? We should. Please note, at no point, this is the other false dichotomy I sometimes get in comments when people think I'm saying this stuff and I'm being nasty about the Air Force. No. I have literally would quite happily march with a placard in front of the Treasury if I thought it would get decent air defense missiles, like sort of a Patriot equivalent for the British Armed Forces. I would do that quite happily. Because they need it. But leaving that to one side, a couple of batteries of heavy anti-aircraft guns with ammunition and control gear. Now, I have to say, this is the thing which I am most annoyed about with the Queen Elizabeth class. I feel that, especially with the Type 31s coming into service, with their 57mm, their 40mm Bofors, etc., there was opportunities for some synergy for some very useful weaponry to be put onto them to provide them proper defense. And whilst the reason we don't normally put missiles, but I'll get into this more detail later, is because of the fragments on deck problem, the FOD issue, and the fact that anything sucked up into your engines can cause problems. Let's be honest, the Royal Navy has shown this with an F-35. Well, the British have shown this because one of the covers wasn't counted off properly. I think as the story goes, and an F-35 was lost in the sea because its engine was fragged out. A minor Battersea power station. Yeah. If you consider the power plant we're talking about putting in these ships, some aircraft carriers have full nuclear reactors in them. There is a lot of stuff which has to go in there to maintain and support that, let alone the ones which have gas turbines. They also have to have fun. A big radio transmitting and receiving station. Oh yeah. The radar, communications, and other ancillaries of an RAF fighter sector controller. Something which they don't have for every station. They might have one of those for covering multiple stations. But yeah, you have all that. All the crew. In this case, they're talking about 2,000 all told. Not far off it, no. Accommodation for these functions. And all the personnel to support those. All the people to support their needs. Food, medical care, all those things. Issue them with about 3 months to provisions. Yeah, it's still about 90 days of provisions they will carry. Put the whole thing inside a metal box, 800 feet long by 90 feet wide by about 90 feet high. Make the box self-propelled and operate aircraft from the top of the lid. There is your aircraft carrier. Ouch. Sometimes when you read things like this, it really does scare you because it still works. And you notice the whole thing, what it's about, is pretty much, it's the space to operate aircraft. The aircraft carrier's function is about the operation of aircraft. That's why we build them. We don't build them because we like building aircraft carriers. We build them because they are useful, and as long as we need to operate aircraft, doesn't matter whether they're crewed or uncrewed, we'll probably need something like an aircraft carrier. And the same is always going to be true. Larger is going to be more efficient than smaller because you can carry more aircraft. If I'm carrying 30 aircraft and I have 10% go down, I'm down to 27. 60 aircraft, 10% goes down, I'm down to 54. I can do a lot more with 54 than I could do with 27. But here's the other thing. Let's say I need to generate a strike of 18 aircraft. I have a 30 aircraft vessel. That's a hefty amount of my force. And that's going to probably strain me to generating it out. For a 60 aircraft vessel, that's not. And as I talked about in the two historians with Drac, and pointed out, Drac, I think, did the full discussion on this. Literally, we size up carriers by how many sections of aircraft you want, i.e., how many rows of aircraft, and how wide you want those roads to be. Do you want to accommodate 3 aircraft per row, 4 aircraft per row, 5 aircraft per row? How many rows do you want? If If you want to have 5 aircraft per row and accommodate 18 rows, there you go. That's going to be your size of your carrier. That's what defines your size of your carrier also. The size of the aircraft you're putting in there. And I've talked about all this in the first video. But I felt it's good to start with a little bit of restatement. So let's start off with the big problem and the big thing you need to get involved in. People! People! Whether they are crew, people involved in the construction, all the walks of life, you need people. You need a lot of them. So you need a certain size of population to be able to sustain that number for the first place. This is the small problem. If you have a too small population to be able to sustain that capability, you're going to run into trouble. There is a reason why New Zealand, despite being one of the most sensible and capable and effective of the Royal Navies in World War II, never operated an aircraft carrier. In fact, the closest they got was HMS New Zealand, a Malta-class aircraft carrier, which was assigned that name, but of course was never completed. And would probably have been like HMS New Zealand, the battlecruiser, operated with that kind of style and approach, as in, yes, we will do a lot of work in the Pacific region, we'll do a lot of work with Australasia, we'll probably have a fairly large chunk of RNZN sailors aboard, but we're not a New Zealand ship because they don't have the size to support us. Now, this goes for not just the carrier, but also the carrier battle group. You need a certain amount of mass and sustainability. And the problem with this can be long-term, and it often is long-term. You see, not only do governments like peace dividends, they like to focus on the sharp, pointy end of defence. They're often very focused on that. They often neglect the infrastructure and logistical part of it. They often forget the fact that, well, if you cut the training and recruitment budget, and if you're not training and recruiting enough, you will not have enough personnel. And also, if you keep mucking around with the service numbers and service personnel, you will destroy retention. Because people don't stay for 20 years, or rather don't risk trying to stay for 20 years, if they think they might get chucked out after 15. Because think about it, if you do 20 years in the armed forces, you've joined up when you're 20, you're going to be in your 40s. It's a tough physical job. It is. If you get out in your 40s, and you need to retrain then, to do anything else, that's going to be costly and time consuming, and you're going to want to make sure you have the ability to do that, and you've had the time to save up and put the resources behind you. But let's say you get out in your 30s, early 30s, life's far easier. And if you add in that if there's issues of accommodation, if you have a young family and you can never see them, never take care of them, that causes problems. Now, part of that is the changing view of the world. I could point to my granddad's generation, my great-granddad's generation, when they served. They would be gone for months on time, like today, and they would not have the access to phones and systems which could allow them to call home. And it'd be even a tangential part of their life. But I had an interesting conversation with my granddad many years ago. And it was when email was just beginning, but he'd been talking with a friend of his whose, I think it was his grandson, because he was older than me though, had gone into the Navy. And my granddad actually felt it was slightly easier for his generation and his father's generation to go off and serve. Because with the pace of letters, as anguished as you might feel over sad news, you didn't feel the same pressure to do something, to be part of it, because you couldn't. you couldn't do anything. You couldn't dash to ask for emergency bereavement leave and get off home because your mother had died. And that's terrible, but that's also in some ways freeing. Because you're never in a situation where you're going to have to worry you might have to do that, because you can't do that. So you've got to work out how you're going to sustain enough people and how you're going to support them. And that requires everything. Whether those people are working in industry, building it, are working in administration, are all these things you have to work out. And you have to also continually make the case to your own public, why the forces are necessary. Because when you walk outside your door and there's no problems, the roads don't have potholes in, maybe they do, but you don't see any fighting, you don't have to worry about people dropping bombs on you or any of those risks. It's very, very easy to forget that as being an actual risk to you. Many nations in the West and many nations in the world which are the ones who could have carrier programs are very fortunate in that they have not had experience of such a war for a long time. Of an actual peer-on-peer conflict, of an actual war where there is a threat to them. Wars of choice was a doctrine of luxury, bred from the idea that no one would dare start wars on you. And yes, there have been terrorist incidents, but the thing is, terrorist incidents are traumatic because they come out of nowhere and take us when we're not expecting anything. Peer conflict, that's annihilation. The bombs that modern aircraft can drop, they make most devices we've seen on the news when there have been incidents look, well, don't want to say like party poppers because that sounds too cruel, but it's not too far off that. It sounds too bellicose and rude. So you have to, without traumatizing or making your population absolutely petrified, because let's be honest, the trouble with using fear as a methodology of pushing humans to do things is it only can last so long before, when nothing's yet happened, they start to disbelieve you. Witness a lot of discussions over climate change. Now, climate change is a factor. There are many potentials in it, and I always remember a physics master of mine who liked to talk about the fact that the Earth is not just going round the sun, but also slightly spinning off, sort of around the sun, because it's technically orbiting a common centre with the moon in its little mini orbit, and again with the sun, it's technically all orbiting it might as well be the sun in the centre of the solar system, and slightly moving and tilting around that, and the sun is going up and down through space and going through the Milky Way and passing through radiation clouds and all sorts of things, and all these have an impact on the Earth as well as what humankind is doing. And I sat there and said, so it's complicated, right? Yeah. I was a thoughtful 15-year-old, I have to say. I ended up doing A-level physics with him. The point is, though, climate change, we can all see to an extent, is happening. But because for years it's been sold as this worst case scenario is going to happen right now if you don't change, there's now a large body of the public who take absolutely no notice of it at all. In fact, arguably, they're getting to the point where they're actually almost rooting for it. because it's been so the fear's been constantly selling it on fear, not on potential of the green economy and all these things, not on the potentials of new technologies of how they could be used to improve lives and all those things. No, it's all been on fear. And it's the same with the armed forces. They cannot afford to keep petitioning from a position of fear. If you consider the Royal Navy, when it was most successful funding, it wasn't fear, it was pride. It was national pride, national honour. The We Want 8, We Won't Wait campaign wasn't about the Germans, it was We Want 8. We, the public, the people, the country, demand 8. That is the difference. One of the reasons why, again, I'm using the UK because it's the example I'm most familiar with intimately, but I could talk about others, but I'm going to use the UK because I am British. So I can draw these examples, but think about them as they apply to your own country, please. And I'd love to hear what your ideas come through for this. One of the things the British public take pride in is the NHS. It's the National Health Service. There's a reason it showed up in 2012 Olympics and all the other things. There's a reason it's a third rail in British politics to try and mess with. And there's a reason why the usual argument for most groups is, oh, you need more funding to save the NHS. Well, for a long time, Britain has felt pride in the NHS. But I'd say the mantra of saving the NHS, as true or as not true as it may be, and there are others who are far more expert than me to speak on this, I'd say it's always been more of an issue of management rather than funding. But we'll leave that to one side. That's my own personal view of looking at the subject, because I have great faith for the people on the front lines, and most of the admin on the front lines. It's the ones elsewhere which I worry about, but we'll leave that to one side. It's sort of becoming slightly more controversial. People are still proud of the NHS as a service and as the people in the front line. But I think as a government department, there's now starting to be a lot of questions about the health department and its role in it. And the problem is because the conversation was changed from pride and value by mainly politicians keep campaigning on the we must save the NHS from the other political party. Yes, it wins you votes, but it undermines the pride. Because if it's at such a great risk, then why is it at risk? Why is it at that risk? Becomes the question. Politics is a great thing because people always elect in rhetoric and they govern in prose. But rarely do politicians consider the long-term impacts of their electoral rhetoric on their nation as a whole. Rarely do they. We can look through history at this. It's rarely considered, and it's a constant problem. Now, shipyards is an obvious one, and I thought I'd do this before I did the Shameless book plug. Why is shipyards so obvious? Well, because you need something to build these ships. Build an aircraft carrier. In the 1930s, the Royal Navy worked out there were roughly 173, and you can see their numbers listed there of where they are, which area and how many are listed in that area. 173 shipyards around the UK, which could be used for the construction of warships of some grade. 173 shipyards that could produce warships of some grade. Now, not all those could produce aircraft carriers, of course, or battleships, or the larger ships, but that was the opportunity the Royal Navy was exploiting in the 1930s, when a lot of our rules for competition and ship construction were written, and are still basically the rules as we're applying them today. there were 173 potential contestants for every shipbuilding award. Every chance to build a ship, every tender the Royal Navy puts out could theoretically have any number of these if they had a big enough yard and facility to do it. These days, well, I did a video recently about dry docks, and that basically explained it all. There aren't that many to choose from in the UK anymore. There just aren't. Now, these facilities, they have a lot in them. These days, if we consider Rosyth, where they built the Queen Elizabeth class, there was a huge amount of construction involved in them. They came from multiple yards. Sections were built and then floated to Rosyth and then assembled at Rosyth. It was multiple yards work to produce them. And that was attractive to the British government because of two reasons. One, it allowed them to get the ships built at a certain pace. Theoretically, when they were first ordering them and when they weren't planning on delaying them, it would have got them built more quickly. So they'd been in service to take the Harrier. Then they, of course, delayed them, so that caused all sorts of repercussions, but leave that to one side. And the biggest advantage, though, was because for any project building these aircraft carriers, they're not going to be required to be built that often. If you put all the work in one yard, that yard is going to have to surge employ a huge amount of people for the contract while building them, to build at the pace you need to build, and then going to make everyone have to make a large number redundant. That is very bad economics and very bad for the people involved. So by spreading the workload out around multiple yards, you didn't have to surge grow down employment. Yes, you still grow down employment, but it was the sustainable way, and it was the small numbers around lots of yards where they could afford to have them. It also allows you to spread the wealth in terms of the money from the project, which goes into the yards to help develop the yards' technologies, to develop their skills, to make them more competitive in the commercial market and other and bidding for other jobs, and allows you to foster the employment and training of hopefully the next generation within the current generation of shipyard workers and shipyard builders who you need to build these vessels. The problem is these are a vital resource, and they are becoming an increasingly rare resource. To such an extent that some of them have developed, even in America, as with all its construction for the US Navy, as de facto monopolies. De facto monopolies. Now, France, to preserve the carrier, which the shipyard which they wanted to build their new PNG carrier, the new fancy carrier. Not PNG, is it? Sorry, I think that was wrong. Their new aircraft carrier, the nuclear-powered vessel they've decided to build. They actually nationalized the Saint-Nazaire yard in 2017. It's the largest yard in France, and they said it was a temporary state control to save jobs and preserve the yard, but pretty much, whilst they have now, to an extent, set up I would say, a arm's length company to run it, they've pretty much still nationalised it. The French did that because they'd had an ongoing argument with the previous Korean owners of the shipyard at Saint-Nazaire, and that's why the Charles de Gaulle didn't get built there, why it didn't get built in the biggest yard that France had. And they didn't want it passing into Italian hands after it was going into trouble. A European Union member, an ally of NATO, etc. Still, the French government went, no, because this is going to be the critical yard for us. If we want to build a decent next generation carrier, we need this yard, and we have rules where it has to be built by a French yard. Basically. Informal or formal rules, depends on your perspective on them. But the French don't like going not even to foreign owned facilities to build their ships and build their forces, let alone going to actually foreign facilities. Because it's considered important to them to build in France to maintain the infrastructure in France. Because you see, shipyards are not just where ships are built. They are the ends of huge supply chains, infrastructure chains, which devolve to them. All of the supplies come together in smaller components, slowly building up, till it gets bigger and bigger sections until it gets to the shipyard where it's mounted and organized and put into this ship. And since it's been made modular, there might be multiple shipyards also, feeding in from their own resources, their own sources, their own materials coming in, their own supply chains feeding into them, and then those shipyards, the components coming into the big shipyard. Now, I'd say one of the fun things, of course, is that France has done all that to maintain the largest yard. You've got the US government's approach to the yard which builds their aircraft carriers, which is pretty much... anyone even looks at it funny, the US government gets very, very interested in their banking. Very, very interested in their banking. To such an extent that no one feels it's a good idea. Just leave it be. Leave it be. And then we got Britain, which went for the biggest yard, which was in a former Prime Minister's / prior to that Chancellor of the Exchequer's constituency. Look, I'm not saying that it was the wrong decision. It didn't got aircraft carriers into service, and frankly, you needed the aircraft carriers. You do. The third video is going to talk more about those sort of things. But not necessarily the best from a pure procurement strategy perspective to have gone for that. Or without doing some hefty work to the yard more than was done. With that, shameless book plug time. So why do I do a shameless book plug in every video? Why? Well, basically it comes down to a simple thing. I'm a naval historian. I'm a British academic naval historian. And I need to fund my research. And also I need to... I kind of prefer when I get contract lecturing roles and get those teaching instead of doing the other teaching other options I can have for employment. I don't mind them. I am, as I always said, kind of equal opportunities when it comes to putting food on the table. I will do whatever works in front of me with a smile on my face because it needs to get done and I like to eat. But if I have my choice, if I have two options for employment, and one happens to be teaching, I will go with that. Because I enjoy the chats, I enjoy the nuance, I enjoy the seminars. And in the UK, doesn't matter if you're a contract lecturer or what you are, you get hired based pretty much on how successful your research is. And they judge the research by how many people have downloaded and read your journal articles and how many people have bought your book. So, journal articles... I prefer to send people to the books. I prefer to send people to the books because the books, honestly, to my mind, are better value for money than the journals. And that probably will get me into trouble with the journals. But I find the whole business model for the journals slightly worrying. The fact that it's quite often no pay for the authors, no pay for the reviewers, and all the money goes to the publishing houses which run it. And they charge quite so much money. And whilst I realise there are some who are better, there are many which aren't. And when you make it, then make that and publishing in that a cornerstone of promotion in academia, you have, to my mind, cannibalized the main virtue of academia, which was the ability of it, theoretically, with tenure and the other things, to be able to take a step apart from society and say what needed to be said, no matter how unpopular. without fear of losing your job. And you might be right, you might be wrong as an academic. There's always the idea that anyone who believes as an academic they're always going to be right. No, you're not. When you get your PhD, you don't get them on the... No one knocks you on the head with a sword and goes, "You shall now forever be wrong." No. It means you've done a certain level of research, and you're happy within your research, to the research level you've been trained to. You're happy with your answer to that level. But if new information comes to light and it shows you're wrong, you're expected to say, "Mea culpa, let's write a new paper." And that's pretty much what I do with this channel, which is I will just record new videos. I'll leave the old ones up there with a note going, "Please go to the new video." That takes account of the new information available. So where are we? Well, we had the oops of the 2nd of December. The oops of the 2nd of December. And now we're on the 10th of December. HMAS Castlemaine came out yesterday. 2 Historians comes out tomorrow. We have ASW operations around the world on Thursday evening. We have key ships on Friday, and I'm not quite sure which key ships that's going to be. What ship? There are a couple I'm sort of considering for that one. We have the Long Patrol and the Monroe Doctrine on Saturday. And then we have HMAS Diamantina on Monday. 2 Historians next Tuesday. And it just carries on. There's a lot of fun stuff coming up. World War I Tribals, the premiere. That's something I'm looking forward to. Because the World War I Tribals are an interesting bunch. They get out to all sorts of nutty stuff. Then there's the Battle at LA and key aircraft, which will probably... I have listened to everyone's demands on other points on the channel and discuss this below as well, if you think it's the right idea or not. But I'll probably be doing the Santa's Sleigh. Santa's Sleigh is what I'll probably be doing. But yes, these are the videos we have coming up. These are the videos I'm able to do because of your support for the channel, because of your support for my research, because of people liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, all the things they do. So thank you. You're what makes it all possible. Now, there were many options to use to illustrate dry docks for this video, and I decided to go with a 75-meter long one from Penzance in Cornwall, not far from where I now live. And I went with that because you're never fitting an aircraft carrier on that. And it makes the point, really, for me. In that there are dry docks and there are dry docks. You have to have enough dry docks of the right size to fit your ships. Now, you can go about this in various means. You could decide that your naval dockyard should have a dry dock of suitable size, in which case you pretty much have a dry dock facility which is not a commercial facility. It's entirely at the disposal of the Royal Navy, entirely at the disposal of the Ministry of Defence, or the US government, or whatever, and whatever government owns it. And you can put your ships in there and decide when a ship goes in or out of there as to your wishes. Within the limitations of tide, probably, and weather, but yeah, pretty much it's at your will. If you're going to rely on commercial dry docks, though, and the facilities may be where you build the ships as well, then things become more complicated. Because they might well have something under construction there. They might have something they can't move out of the dry dock for you to use. Which means you have to start factoring that into your operational plans. You see, it's very easy with ships to go, well, I've got this long-term plan where we're going to send them in for refit then, and then, and then, and then. And there was someone who did a whole comment the other day. I'm going to do a response in a comment response video, which was basically, well, you know, merchant ships don't operate the way Navy ships do. Why do they have to have, why will, you know, 1/3 of them not be at sea at any one point and the other third possibly in training, and why will 1/3 be in refit? Well, the problem is the difference between merchant ships, which are designed with a huge amount of redundancies and far less complicated systems in many regards than warships, because they're not involved in, I don't know, shooting at each other and trying to kill each other as an active part of their role, or defending themselves from air attack, is that they are designed around a far more simple, a single role. A container ship is designed around carrying containers. It isn't designed around multiple different functions. You don't also go, well, you know, you're a good container ship, but I think we should also make you a bit of an oil tanker and a bulk carrier. And no, you don't want to. There are smaller ships which are sort of general purpose out of assets to do that, but they're rarer and rarer. Usually the major merchant ships you have are very much focused in on one role. Whereas, if you mount an aircraft carrier, or before you even get on a modern escort, they could be supporting anti-submarine warfare operations, presence missions, deterrence missions, air defense, strike, airborne early warning, electronic warfare, all sorts of different missions they could have to support. And here's the other really big thing which does drive a fairly large chunk of maintenance. If a merchant ship looks rusty, it doesn't make front page of the news worldwide. If a merchant ship breaks down, unless it's doing so in a very awkward place, i.e. the Suez Canal, or similar, it doesn't make worldwide news. If an aircraft carrier has a hiccup, it makes worldwide news. There's a bit of a difference, therefore, in the maintenance requirements. And so you need dry docks. You need to have facilities you can approach, commercial facilities. Not just locally, but internationally, where you're going to deploy the ships. You might have to consider them. This was one of the reasons why Singapore mattered, why floating dry docks matter. And one of the things I really wish the British had invested in would be a decent floating dry dock when building the Queen Elizabeth class. For the French, with only one large carrier, that's going to also be something they might have to consider, especially if they're only designed completely around Saint-Nazaire, and therefore if Saint-Nazaire is busy, they're in trouble. They're in trouble. Because it's one thing going, well, we have another dry dock which has the same space. Does it have the same facilities to support those aircraft? Because the dry dock is not just about the dock, and this 75-metre one is a great illustration of it. Look at how big the buildings are that support its operations that are behind it in relation to the size of the dry dock. That is a 75-metre dry dock, and there is a large industrial building space about covering about 4 to 5 times its area behind it. And this is a commercial site. This is a site which focuses in on supporting merchant vessels, shipping vessels. It doesn't even see Royal Navy patrol boats. Certainly doesn't have to have separate storage places to stick weapons and make sure their electronics are being dealt with. There's no scenario where you're going to have it de-stowed of ammunition, which is another thing for warships, of course, before they can go in. Wonder if this adds time to them going in and out of refit, because before they go in for a major refit, they have to have all the ammunition taken off them, because you can't have them going into dock with ammunition on, and then you have to reload the ammunition on them, and then they have to go and pass the certifications to use that weaponry as well. Everything adds up. The complications of the role add up. And the complications of the different functions add up. And getting everything to work together, all the different parts of the ship to work together. One of the things I remember talking about when I visited a ship involved in FOST after it had come out of dry dock. That's Flag Officer Sea Training in the UK. The captain was quite honest with me. He said, we'll be mechanically certified and the ship will be physically certified within about a month. We'll have got through all the testing, everything to actually be able to go to sea and be happy with it. In terms of operational ability of getting that crew to the standard at which we want to go on operations with them, that's going to take another 2 to 3 months beyond that. Because we're not just training them to do the air defense role. We're not just training them to do one mission. We've got to train them to do a dozen to 2 dozen missions. And they've got to be able to do that. Because you can't swap crews in the middle of the ocean and go, you know what, all the people we've got here are trained for the air defense and anti-submarine role. We've now got to do disaster relief. So yes, what we want to do is we want to fly everyone home who's here, and then you can't do that. It takes time. But it's far easier and far better operation and capability and ability to react to events if you train everyone to the high standard. But all this is only possible if you have dry docks available when you need them for your ships to go in for maintenance, and for your ships to go in when they have a problem, when they, let's say, damage a shaft. Now, for those who don't know, and I'm hoping my viewership, I have a feeling the people who view this video and have got this far it'll be a very small number who might not know this, but I'm just going to clarify for those who don't. We have the propeller on the end. Okay, that's what's spinning to transmit power from the engines, however it's created and however it's passed on into the water to move the ship. Most times they use a propeller. The thing which connects that propeller to whatever is providing it with the turning motion is the shaft. Now the shaft will actually go through the hull. It will have seals on it that will hopefully prevent leaks happening. But as it's a hole in the hull, underwater, with constant wear of constant movement of materials on it, that can change very quickly. And as such, if it changes, you need to fix that problem rather quickly. And you're not going to fix that problem by just going, let's patch it up from the inside. You're going to take it into a dry dock. You're going to want to get it checked from both sides as properly as you can, because if you need to take things apart and put in a new seal, you're going to be able to do that, pretty darn quickly. You can do that in a dry dock. Now, if you have to wait for merchant ships to get out of the way, you've got a problem. If you have to maybe wait until the weather's safe enough for you to do a voyage from wherever your base is to wherever the dry dock is that can actually support you, because you're going through particularly rough seas, that's also a problem. Because that's just going to compound the delay and add more damage done to it. More damage will be done, more water will egress, and water, especially salt water, tends to have a cumulative impact in terms of inflicting damage on things. So yeah, dry docks, they matter. They really do. We've got plant manufacturers. Now, you're going to need access to this. Plant, what are we talking about? I'm talking about engines. I'm talking about waste disposal. I'm talking about the whole data farms, pretty much, that go into there to provide the modern computing and communication systems that support ship operations. If you want a good example of a nation which absolutely managed to hammer itself, you have Russia in 2014 with 2014 with their actions in Ukraine. Because Ukraine was where they got all their plant from. So the Admiral Gorshkov class, all their latest frigates, all their new designs that they spent so much money pouring effort and energy into to develop something which was going to be a really useful method of reaching out to the world and showing their status. Well, it turns out the people, if you attack them, stop supplying you with engines. Who'd have thunk it? I mean, we're just invading your country. We're just acting in our own national interests, and as we view them. And you decided to stop supplying us with the engines, which underpin our ship construction? Why would you be so petty? Honestly, Russia should have looked back to its past of World War I, because, of course, they were buying cruisers off the Germans, but there is another classic scenario in that all the German really fast ships, and quite a lot of Germans with ships with turbines in them in World War One, were powered by Parsons turbines. The British built Parsons turbines. And yes, they had some infrastructure to support and sustain them in Germany, but it soon proved an issue, and one of the reasons why they don't use the high seas fleet as much as they would like to in World War One was because they didn't have the parts to sustain using it, even if they wanted to. I know. Who'd have thunk it? Britain being so stupid, as in during the Anglo-German naval race, to let the Germans become dependent upon their engines. Now, you can point to the British and go, well, hang on, weren't they buying fuses off of the Germans for their shells? And didn't their correction to build their own fuses lead to some of the problems with their shells at Jutland, which then, of course, led to the Green Boys, which were very, very good, but also led to some of the issues they had at Jutland? You'd be right. But the point is there, the British went away and developed their own, so they weren't reliant. It wasn't very good, not necessarily as good as they wanted it to be, but it worked. Barely speaking. And it's the plant manufacture is important. You know, if you are designing a ship, this can be part of the function of how independent you are as a nation. What facilities and what engineering you put in there. Do you want to buy emails, electromagnetic assisted launch system? Well, if you're using gas turbines and nuclear power, that's pretty much what you probably need these days, and the way they work. But especially gas turbines, because they generate electricity, and that's. But that means are you building them domestically yourself, or are you buying them from an ally? And especially for those producing just a few carriers, this is actually a vital thing to think about, because if you're, let's say, Britain, and you think, well, we could buy emails. The Americans are producing design. BAE are working on it. So that's British Aerospace Engineering. That's a British company. Yes, the American branch. And the French are doing that. So we could do that. But what happens if we're in a war at the same time as the Americans and we both experience problems or damage to our ships at the time? Who's going to get the priority for replacement parts, considering how long it takes for emails to be made and manufactured? The rate of production is not very high because there aren't that many ships, airships, which are going to be equipped with them. Probably the Americans will prioritize themselves. They're good allies, but it's going to be the sensible thing for them to prioritize their own carrier, which means our carrier is going to be waiting for that delivery, which could be weeks or months before it could be returned into service. Now, the French have gone with that, well, we've got we're going one carrier, we're going the best we can. And the best we can, we've decided for the full heavier suite. But this is one of the ideas which has to go into discussion. The British have decided to go with the ski ramp system, with the Vistol system, which ultimately, to keep working, requires the application of steel and a few other materials. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a large part of the discussion, specifically about emails and about the operation of your carrier strike group and how your carrier is going to be lined out and what sort of system you're going to use. But it is part of the discussion. It is. And it's the same with engines, it's the same with toilet systems, it's the same with computers being chosen, it's the same with a lot of the structures, lift design and lift systems. You'd be amazed. And when I say you, I mean pretty much everyone being, unless you've been involved in the process, how much of the thought sometimes goes into the selection, how much value has to be placed on, do we produce this ourselves, or does this come from multiple suppliers within allies? Or is it a single source supply that only comes from one ally? In which case, that's a single point of failure if there's any problems. Now, sometimes you're forced into that route. There are literally no other options. There's no alternative. And frankly, that's when you do that. But otherwise, you might want to think other ways and other things through. what's even more fun is it doesn't stop there. Then we have electronic systems, including this lovely landing aid. Now, for those who don't know, this is the Fresnel lens optical landing system from the Charles de Gaulle. Now, these systems, because of their design, can be, because of the relatively simplicity, more easily manufactured as one-offs by different nations. So they are, to an extent, domestically aware of what we produce, but they often do also come kind of standardized across, let's say, alliances, and pretty much standardized as is, actually, in many ways, because of what they provide. They're a very simple electronic system, but when we consider that emails, again, fall on electronic systems, that's electromagnetic assisted launch systems, radars, communications, all sorts of systems, well, not just the lighting, but it might be even the drive, and it also could be all sorts of diagnostic systems and scanning systems and maintenance systems used for the aircraft and the crew. You start to realize that that line at the beginning, well, the three lines at the beginning, the RAF station operating this many aircraft, the power station, the radio transmitting and receiving station, the radar control, radar communications, and the series of fighter sector controller. You start looking down at this and go, every single one of those things has electronic systems underpinning it or involved in it. Every single one these days. Carriers, in many ways now, are floating collections of computing power. They have to be to do their job in the modern world. Now, this creates problems, creates issues, but it also creates a necessity in terms of your population. As well as you having to worry about having enough people and having the support of the public, you have to worry how qualified the people are going to be, how well their base knowledge is going to be for them to be able to work with these systems, or how much you're going to have improved them. Because all these things are going to require a certain level of understanding of the knowledge of flying to maintain them, a knowledge of ships to maintain them. And whilst, yes, being a sailor, you're going to be trained up to that, if you consider if the base level of the population is here, and you're requiring for the electronic systems, let's say the radars, people to be capable of doing this level of knowledge, you've got a rather large gap to fill it. But if you've got the base population to here, that's a lot less of a gap. Now this, also, there are two ways of dealing with this problem. You can try and raise the population's level of technology. Three ways, I should say. You can reduce the amount of population you can take to do that job by saying we'll only take people who have this level of qualification, so they have raised themselves up. Or you can go for a simpler, potentially more basic or less capable system, which again reduces your cost of training up. Those are your three options. You either reduce the system, reduce the population that you can draw from, or increase the education level of the population. All these things will affect your carrier's ability to operate and your carrier's ability to use infrastructure. And all these things will also affect how you go about implementing parts of the design and parts of the operation. Yeah, electronic systems. They're also often some of the things which are most spread out about the country. So they can be the longest supply lines for various shipyards and for you to get. They can also be the ones which are spread most easily internationally. Because often it's far easier to get multiple nations to work together on systems than it is to, say, whole ships. National pride, again, usually comes into that. quite a lot of nations will quite happily accept that every single system involved in the ship is produced by an alliance of multiple nations. But the ship itself has to be built in country, assembled in country, and look distinctly of that country. And honestly, if you look at projects like the Horizon class frigate project, and the reason that fell apart, if they'd made it a technology rather than a ship design project, and just concentrated on, we are developing the technology for these vessels together, and then we're going to build to our own versions of that. We're all going to use versions of the same power plant, etc., and all these things, but one of us might use 3 power packs, one of us might use 2, one of us might use 1, depending on what we need, sort of thing. I think they'd have been more successful. I honestly think they'd have made it work better, because the difference in what Italy and France wanted was close enough that they eventually did build something which was, broadly speaking, the same class. Broadly speaking, there are definite differences, but the British wanted something which was altogether very different. But they all wanted to use the same technology, so make the project about the technology. Because the electronic systems, they are something you have to get right. If they don't work together, and if they don't work, and any of those systems doesn't actually work, you are going to have a lot of problems. A lot of problems. Now, you've got your aircraft carrier project. You're building it. That's great. And you've got dry dock sorted out. That's wonderful. But ships don't live in dry dock. They tend to pull aside jetties. They tend to get armed from wharves. And you need to store ammunition for them in places that they can easily get that access to that ammunition, and fuel and other supplies, so they can easily be loaded and unloaded as they need. Now, for Britain, this was not exactly great, because it was realised very quickly that the new aircraft carriers were very big. And the trouble is, some bright sparks got during the Cold War had thought that ships weren't going to be that big again for the Royal Navy, so they hadn't kept up the jetties. So this jetty had to be actually rebuilt. They had to be built to take the weight of the carriers, pressing against them. They had, in a way which wasn't going to damage the carrier's hull or the jetty when the waves and the tide moved them that way. They had to be built so they could supply the carriers. They had to be built so that they could provide power for the carrier to run when it's shoreside, etc., so it doesn't have to run its own systems if it doesn't want to. All sorts of things had to be factored into them to make them viable spaces. And it's not just what the jetty can do, what can be done with that space. It's also getting access to it. It's dredging out access to it. My dad used to say that he knew that the next generation carrier project was coming, and what became the Queen Elizabeth class, the moment they actually found the money to actually recover the Mary Rose. Because she was actually pretty much on the path they've dredged in and dredged out for these ships, which was a long, long time ago. My dad was a naval architect, though, and, well, he was fond of saying such things. I'm never quite sure how true they were. But it's a very true statement to make that you had to that the important thing was going to be access. There's no point spending all this money building this jetty. There's no point having this facility if you can't access it. In fact, the argument goes, well, perhaps you shouldn't have had them at Portsmouth then. One can argue the Royal Navy was so insistent on Portsmouth because of this image. You have HMS Victory. You have M19, a monitor from World War I. You have the Mary Rose. You have HMS Warrior not far along that way. You have the full Naval Museum going over both sides. of this stretch of water. Having the modern aircraft carrier parked in the middle of it. Oh, is that useful? That is an image. That is a statement. That's appealing to pride and continuity. It's worth it. But saying that, and I am saying that, the US also has to have a big park for their carriers and facilities, and so do the French. In fact, everyone who has these things has to have these facilities. And because they are limited in how many there are, they are, kind of like airfields are for aircraft, a point of ouch. Now, just because these are the only purpose-built facilities doesn't mean these are the only facilities you can use. For example, HMS Prince of Wales, on the weekend just past, and so I'm talking to you on the 10th of December 2024, has been in Liverpool. And while she was at Liverpool, she was Jettyside. She was able to allow people to come aboard her and get off her. But those people had to board through, well, a set of stairs which was put up by scaffolding. Now, you can do that. You can do that. That's a perfectly viable option. But that's the problem, isn't it? That's a viable option, but it's not really a good one for offloading and unloading supplies onto an aircraft carrier. They weren't using it for this because she already had her supplies. She'd gone up for a public being open to the public for a few days and generally having a march through the city and generally doing the things which you need to do with domestic political concerns in mind for Navy and making a case for your funding and your existence. But on top of that, the fact that Liverpool, which regularly takes cruise liners, which has all sorts of facilities there, even they had trouble, and even they had to go to some very definition of temporary methodologies to make it viable, shows you there isn't much depth to the resources available. For US aircraft carriers, it's worse. How often do you see them actually moored up anywhere other than their designated dock? Usually they sit off and do it by boat access or helicopter. And again, it works. You can do it. But it's not going to be as quick or as efficient to transfer stores. It's not going to be as viable as you would like it to be. And these are all things you need to think about before you start it off. You have to think, am I going to do this investment in one place? Am I going to invest in two places? Am I going to invest in one and maybe do a semi-investment in two different extra places? So that, I have these other spaces I can take them to where it's still not going to be perfect setup, but it's going to have enough of improvement to make it worthwhile. I've set up a basic rather than a fulsome experience for them. It's what you need to think through and work out what best works for you as a country. I would say, like with dry docks, it's always better to have spares. It's always better to have facilities you can withdraw to. In case your primary facility is damaged, then you need to make use of something else. But it's up to the governments involved, because each government has their own definition of risks they are prepared to accept. I'm slightly cautious when it comes to risks. Now this is CRAM, which is not fitted to any British ships because of various decisions made. And that does sort of fit. It's mainly used by the US Navy, but other navies are involved in it. It's often used on their aircraft carriers as a protective system. It's an automated system which fires small rolling airframe missiles, which are a very good point defense / close-in weapon system. Now, when you're designing an aircraft carrier, you're looking at not just what weapon systems can you have aboard, what weapon systems are needed to defend the carrier, but what can you sustain on board? What can you fit into the systems you already are going to have? What will work with the aircraft operations? And then what do you have the infrastructure to support? Now, again, I would say you can have a scenario where you go too much the electronic warfare route. You go too much reliance on electronics and other systems to protect your ships, rather than the hard kill systems. But you can also go too far to the hard kill systems. When you see aircraft carriers or vessels which are operating in that role, which have heavy missile batteries, etc., that's probably a useful asset for them to attack ships and systems themselves. But they use those missiles, they're going to be clearing up mess off their decks for the next day and a half, which is going to really ruin their aircraft operations. So they better have another place for those aircraft to land, because if they land on them, they are going to be in a mess. Now, weapon systems surely should come under procurement, purely, rather than infrastructure and ongoing, but it doesn't. Because these are an ongoing commitment. These are going to need to be something you're going to need to evaluate on a regular basis. You're going to have methods of testing on a regular basis to decide whether you just keep them or you replace them with something else. Because the problem is, and I would argue this is a constant, but aircraft carriers, because of the way they operate and what they provide the support that sustains the longest range reach of a naval strike group. They provide the support that sustains the greatest outer defense perimeter. They provide often space for command and control facilities. All these things combined make them target numero uno. Therefore, they need to be able to sustain and support themselves, and they need to be able to defend themselves. Anything that gets through their own fighter cover, their own aircraft, and their task group's force. And with something as valuable as an aircraft carrier, you can't afford to think, oh, I'm sure it gets stopped by something else. To give you an example, recently there's been a lot of talk about the Red Sea and operations there to deal with the Houthis and their attacks on merchant shipping. Now, a lot of that debate and discussion tends to equate the price of the missiles being used to intercept drones and the price of the drones. It's often said of, it's not economically sustainable to use a missile costing X to destroy drone Y. And to an extent, you're not wrong. You can certainly produce more drones for the same price. How useful those drones are depends on the target. And that's where the real point comes in. The value of the missile to intercept the drone and its differential should not be considered versus the value to replace the cost of what might be destroyed by that drone. If the drone costs £500 and the missile costs £100,000, it can seem quite no-brainer. Well, yes, we want that. It's far more sensible to be using drones than missiles. In this scenario, we'll wipe through because we're able to buy 200 for the price of one missile. True. But if I'm intercepting your drone 60 miles away from my ship, and I'm defending a merchant ship which cumulative value of vessel and cargo and potential disaster damage of its leaking its fuel and cargo over the world's oceans runs into billions of pounds, then £100,000 to prevent you destroying that and causing that damage, that's a steal, baby. It is. That's the basic fundamental problem. You need to always think about how does this reflect to the target. A carrier's value is in the aircraft it can support and sustain. A missile's value, and when it's on air defense role, is in the value of the target it's defending, not in the value of the target it's intercepting. The value of the target it's defending. And it's the same with the weapon systems we're sustaining and supporting on an aircraft carrier. It's a case of, well, theoretically, if you've got the carrier's fighter aircraft out providing the outer perimeter, if you've got a couple of destroyers, at least with you providing the area-to-air defense missiles, providing air defense, and you've got some frigates as well as those destroyers providing point defense missiles, you could argue, no, maybe we don't need to have any weapon systems on a carrier at all. But the question is, well, what are the chances of something leaking through that? And if that thing leaks through, what's the potential damage it would do to the aircraft carrier? How much would that cost us to fix? It's cheaper to put this. Now, the thing about CRAM and other rocket missile-based systems, as I said, they create FOD. They automatically do. Even C-Scepter creates a limited amount of FOD, of fragments on deck. This is why some of us who are involved still do prefer the concept of using guns. And again, the Queen Elizabeth class, they're rather weak. But if we consider the Italians in this approach to this, to Trieste, their new LHD, etc., that has a heavy gun suite. It really does. It has 3 Ottomalera 76. It has 3 Ottomalera 25s in remote control weapon systems. And it also has 16 cells for Aster 50. That can take all 64 CAM ER missiles. Now, to be honest, the Trieste is an LHD. It's operating helicopters primarily. It does have capability to operate F-35Bs, but it's primarily about helicopters and amphibious operations. And it can function those systems off in places where it can provide more limited risk of FOD. But for an aircraft carrier, for quite a lot of those systems, the 76 and the 25, those are very easy to maintain fundamental systems that can provide it with a heavy weight of fire to protect it. Versus Queen Elizabeth classes for phalanx. And for the French, well, they're often even more intriguing. For the Charles de Gaulle, they went with a whole range of missiles. You had A-43 silver launchers carrying, well, 4 of them, 4 8-cell systems carrying 32 Aster 15s, surface to airs, and 2 6-cell Sandra launchers carrying the Mistral missiles, and multiple 20mm cannons for their future one, which is the Pang, of course. I keep calling it the PNG, but it's the PANG, the Pang. Well, that's also having a range of discussions about what weapons that's going to be carrying, and what facilities that's going to be carrying. And all of these, again, are factors into sustaining your ship. Because the weapon systems, rather like armor of old, are as much about if you can minimize damage, or minimize the risk of damage, that minimizes the likelihood of you having to take the ship offline in vital operations times to do maintenance and repair. It's kind of like doing the extra maintenance repair in peacetime is always worth it, because what matters is you having the ship available when you need it in wartime, and if the ship's as well maintained as it can be prior to that, you can tend to push things if you need to when war or conflicts break out. But if you've been pushing the maintenance and pushing the repairs, then you find yourself in a conflict scenario with things not working. Never a good scenario. So what about the aircraft? Why have I put aircraft in here? Well, believe it or not, and this might strike some people as strange, especially the people who every comment they get on an aircraft carrier bring up how many aircraft are aboard an aircraft carrier at any time. And whilst there is a case to be made that the government has poorly structured in the UK, the procurement and governments have poorly structured their aircraft procurement plans. That is not really here or there for this. What we're talking about in this scenario is, do you have an airbase for the aircraft to go to when your ship is not at sea? Because, honestly, you don't want them sitting on the ship. You don't want to have to try and fly them off. You can do that with F-35Bs and helicopters. You can technically launch them and recover them in harbour, but realistically you prefer not to. And you certainly shouldn't do it with anything which is of a stow-bar or catabar operation capability. A short takeoff, barrier assisted recovery, or catapult assisted takeoff, barrier assisted recovery system in harbour. They're usually heavier, and they can have a very instantaneous effect on windows around them if they are launched from within harbour. If you can even get them up without wind going over the deck as well from the movement of the ship. There is a theory. The reality is, if you don't have facilities, infrastructure to support the pilots and the air crews and the technicians and all the engineers and support teams who work on the aircraft, and have a facility for them to go ashore, them to maintain their aircraft, do all the things they need to do with spare airframes, etc., you're going to run out of carrier capability very quickly. This is a key part of sustainment. Such postings ashore are also kind of prized postings in that if we refer to the earlier discussion of having a small family, having a young family, well, if you can get posted, especially posted to such a base for a tour, in an instructor role, in a support role, it can give you a vital couple of years at home with the family, where you have not necessarily the most normal family life, but you have something a far closer approximation to it than if you're constantly touring around the world on ships. And again, with aircrew, this is almost more important, and fitters, because it doesn't matter whether you're a Navy fitter or a Royal Air Force fitter. It doesn't matter whether you're a Navy pilot or an Air Force pilot. Airlines tend to be, how do I put this politely, equal opportunities trying to hire you away. There are also some other organisations as well which would quite like to pick up ex-military flyers, or even if they are current military, incentivising them to make sure they don't re-up and re-engage. And if you are looking at all your deployments ahead and you don't have any prospect of maybe spending some time with the kids as they're growing up, maybe helping out at home, especially if you've got young children and they've got an illness or something like that, then you're probably going to think about leaving. And the thing is, the more people who leave early or leave before you want them to, once they're trained, the more expensive it is for the government to keep A, recruit enough people, and B, train enough to keep enough trained to understand they need to operate the things. Retention always has to be part of your analysis of infrastructure and support. Because, let's be honest, when are personnel most useful? Is it the person who's been in service for 4 years and who's just finished their training as a pilot, or the person who's been in for, let's say, just finished their training as an officer and pilot and actually are now worked up to go on a carrier after about 4 years? Or is it someone who who's been in for 15 years? Who's more useful to you as a naval service? There was an old saying which is about employment in Cornwall, which comes down to miners. And it comes from the first time they started having training for miners. And the phrase that went round the pits, round the mines, down here, as I was passed on to me the other day in the pub. It's a very nice roast dinner the local pub does, and if I have to go, if people want to come down here and meet me, it's far easier for me to go, let's have a meal in the pub than to come over to this place, which is still a moment Box City. So that's what we did. And on the wall was a little saying. And the saying was, training equals potential. Experience equals capability. Training and experience equals wisdom. See, training will give you the theory and some of the practical. Experience will refine that training and refine that practical into a skill. And will give you the knowledge and the depth of confidence in your skill to draw from that will allow you to make the wise choices. For modern armed forces, which have a growing spread and depth and breadth of capabilities and technologies at their disposal, having people who've been in for a long time who are still active learners and actively engaged are worth their weight in gold. They truly are. And yes, sustaining aircraft, you need those air bases to be up to the same standard as the carrier in terms of maintaining the aircraft, in terms of supporting them, and all those things. But most of all, you need those facilities to be at the level they need to be to support the sustainment of the air crews and the fitters and the people who sustain the aircraft. And that leads us all to the final area. The dreaded one. The one which causes the most people to go, but we need to cut this. Now, I loved, when I typed in this picture, I typed in MOD civil servants, and I'm not going to point to them, but there is a reason why the Ministry of Defence, I was considering putting just all the buildings for this and putting the French Ministry of Defence and the British Ministry of Defence and the Pentagon and the August the 1st building or 1st of August building, depending on how you're talking about it. And I decided not to, because when I typed that in, these pictures came up. And one of these pictures has one of my friends in that. And I couldn't resist. And the moment I included one, I went, I have to make it, I cannot make it so, it's so easy. I will put in two pictures, and they might not be able to work out which one of the people in these pictures is my friend. But one of them is a really, really, really cool person. A really cool person. Actually, three of them are actually quite cool, quite interesting people. But one of them's a cool person who I would call a friend. Now, I am often able to be quoted saying, the MOD civil service is quite large. It is. And it needs to be, in many ways, to administer all the things it needs to do for the British Armed Forces. But realistically, I think the Armed Forces could be larger to run off that civil service. But that doesn't mean you should necessarily cut the civil service, because if you're just cutting it, you're cutting expertise in administration. Now, we've been talking about, with aircraft carrier design and aircraft carrier infrastructure, the sheer range of things which need to be organised, ordered, and acquired, and processed. And this is a nightmare. You're talking about systems of systems for every single ship, let alone an aircraft carrier. You're ordering parts and components for missiles, for aircraft, for engines, for all the ships in the task group you're setting up, because you're building a carrier battle group. A carrier is the cornerstone of a carrier battle group. anytime I see a debate where it's going, this carrier versus this aircraft carrier versus this weapon system, this is what happens. And you go, well, it's not. It's the spread of weapon systems they might provide and how they're going to fit and operate together, and sensors, etc., to try and find targets. And it's the spread of capabilities of a carrier battle group and how that's going to fit and operate together, and how those two things are going to interact, which is going to affect it. That doesn't make for an easy, quick, shock horror video. In the case of bureaucracy, in the case of actually having administration, you need some. You need some for these things. And the more complicated systems get, the more you need people to do it. Now, I have to say that I've spent a lot of my time studying the Air Ministry, studying the Admiralty, studying, well, Marble Arch, realistically. The whole work for the Army, the Imperial General Staff, and the Army, the Ministry of the Army, basically, in the UK. And I can honestly say this. In areas where specialists are still required, it's still very, very good. I would say, though, as with most civil services, I think that the problem with civil services has realistically begun in the 1960s, when they started to come up with the idea of, what about having generalist civil servants who will be able to move from department to department? And it was born out of the management school of thinking of managers, and the idea that everything was just the refinement of management and having the best quality. It doesn't matter whether the manager had specific knowledge or technical skills in a certain area. What mattered was they were a good manager, and they would be sent there to run things. I am not so sure about that as a viability. I look back at the days when the Admiralty civil servants were Admiralty specialists. They would never go to a different department. They would stay in the Admiralty for their entire careers. And the same with the Air Ministry ones, etc. And what they brought to the table was a wealth of knowledge built up within their departments to run and deal with the problems that those departments faced. Now, admittedly, there is an advantage to having people coming from outside and go out of departments who can give you, are you sure you're doing the right thing, best practice approach. But I wonder if making everyone a generalist and being able to move between departments is the right idea, or whether multidisciplinary conferences and maybe alternately opening up positions to external candidates from other departments or outside government for roles, and alternately promoting from inside, is the best approach to do that. Because you cannot make anything work if you can't administer it. If you can't track the funding, if you can't ensure the companies that are paid, when it's private companies paid, that the sailors are paid, that everyone's being paid, that the food's being ordered, the parcels, everything's ordered on time, everything's going to get there, and maintain the relationships with those supply chains you need to ensure they function smoothly, you are not going to get anything out of it. And usually at some point someone goes, well, shouldn't the armed forces do it themselves? And then I go, well, then you have to spend a lot of time training a lot of armed forces personnel, people who've joined the armed forces, presumably because they want an active role, an active job, an active function. You're going to go, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you off basically to a business school and technical school as well as staff college, and you're going to spend a large portion of your career sitting at a desk in an office, making phone calls, going to meetings with people, feeling like you're accomplishing nothing when all you're doing is maintaining a relationship because you might need to use that relationship. What's that going to do for retention? How much are those sort of people going to like that? But if you're quite a patriotic person, you enjoy chatting with people, you are quite you would like prefer an office job, and you want to be able to support, but don't want to necessarily do acting, are pretty proactive on it. Oh, well, do I have a role for you? And of course, people can be different at different stages of life. They could start out as they're younger and think, I don't want to do that, I want to be very active. And as they get older, then they go, well, actually, no, that office job sounds rather nice. That is a key thing. But the point is, you need these people. You need this administration set up, because if you don't, you cannot sustain anything. You cannot coordinate all those moving parts. The days when peeps could be single-handedly Secretary of the Navy running and coordinating everything across the Admiralty, across all the dockyards, building ships, with just his ability to write long letters into the night and read information long into the night, have gone. The pace of development is too quick, the breadth is too wide, the complexity is too massive, and the number of communications that require instantaneous response, because this is the problem with emails, they do require instantaneous response because they are an instantaneous form of communication. You always send them and go, have they responded yet? Have they responded yet? Have they responded yet? Or if you're like me, you send off an email and a message to someone, and then you go away and do something else for an hour, and come back and then check your phone and go, oh, good God, they responded immediately. I feel guilty. It requires a lot more efforts than just one person. And everyone needs to know what they're doing to make it work properly. So there you go. That is bureaucracy, and that's the final topic, really, in this discussion. As said, I could have done a video which would have boiled down into everything, into huge details, all the supply chains. But the trouble is that video would be about 36 hours long, and I've done one historiathon, and whilst that has raised enough money to fund the pictures for book number 2, which is going to be a self-published primer on the Flower class corvettes, it's not really a viable option for doing for a video of this nature. I think this one will still end up being, I have no idea, probably the best part of an hour 40, the best part of 100 minutes, which quite a lot of my videos have ended up being lately. And I have to have a question. I always finish my videos with a question, and I'm not going to disappoint this time. And the question is this. One of the things I haven't really discussed at this point is the value of sustainment, in the value of sustainment terms, of having multiple vessels. How, when you're the US Navy and you're operating 11 vessels of sufficient size, that there are compound savings because of the quantity you're operating, because you have that large enough pool of crew that you are now dealing with. You are sustaining crew for 11 ships, which means you have a far larger pool, which means if you have to draw from, which means if you have problems, if people are ill, etc., well, that's going to have less of an impact. If 400 people are ill in the British carrier program, we have a problem. If 400 are ill in the American carrier program, they have an administration issue. Now, part of this is size of the nations involved, and that does affect what carriers and what systems you procure. But there also has to be a factor in that part of it also reflects your level of preparation. So, with that being said, what's today's question? Today's question is, considering what I've said and what I've discussed, I'd like you to think about the systems that go into an aircraft carrier, and really think it through, and think about all the options, and then have a look into it. Look up those systems. Look up those things which are being built, and find out what the closest system is that comes from near you. Because if you're for example, if you're British and you're talking about a British aircraft carrier program, there are thousands of suppliers around the UK who supply different components for those carriers. Thousands of different suppliers. Literally. And that's only two not that massive programs. Yes, two not massive carriers. But if I remember correctly, the really interesting one in the American carrier program was where they get their toilet seats from when I was looking it up. For their toilets. Or rather, for the heads. Please, think about it and go and do some research and find out who is the closest to you. You don't have to comment below. Please, in fact, probably possibly better from your data protection thing. You don't comment below with it, but comment below if you've done it. But look up and find what the nearest firm to you that was involved in the carrier program was. With me, I have a problem. I'm equidistant between about 5 for the UK. And one of those actually also works with the American carrier program. They're really not far away from me. But Cornwall has Caldros, has lots of naval facilities around here, so that's hardly surprising. But if you look at around the right of the UK, you will find someone. You can find them. And you'll be probably quite surprised at how close and how spread out they are. And then think about coordinating all that, supporting and sustaining all that to be able to get these out of it. That is the task of a carrier program. That is the task of an ongoing carrier program once you have them in service. You have to keep those things going. And it all takes time, effort, and money. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.